Okay, great. Out of the interest in time, let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Raul Muniz, and I want to begin by thank you all for joining us today. As we gear up for the 49th Annual SLA Conference, I'm thrilled to introduce this webinar today titled The Business of Boxing, Insights into the Current Legal Issues in Broadcast, Governance, and International Rights. Our expert panelists will discuss the historical evolution of boxing broadcast, the current era of exclusive promoter deal with networks, and the implications of international partnerships. So let me go ahead and get started and introduce our panelists. First, we have Alex Dombroff. He is the head of legal and business affairs at DiBella Entertainment and counsel for Queensberry Promotions. For nearly 10 years, Alex has been representing international promoters in the boxing industry, including DiBella Entertainment and Queensberry Promotions. Alex has negotiated numerous world championship fights, international television and licensing deals, sponsorship and merchandising agreements, as well as handling appeals and negotiations with various boxing commissions and sanctioning bodies. Alex is a graduate of Cardozo Law School, and when he isn't dealing with the powers that be in the world of boxing, he's a player on the World Series of Poker circuit. Next, we have Sunjay Mathews. He's the founder of DJ BAM Consulting and former general counsel of DAZN. Sunjay is a sports, media, and tech executive that helped to launch DAZN in the United States market back in 2018. He's a highly skilled and trained commercial lawyer with experience negotiating and drafting complex transactions, including negotiating multi-billion-dollar sports media acquisitions in the US and international markets. He helped to scale the DAZN business to be live in over 200 countries and negotiated the DAZN Golden Boy partnership, making Canelo Alvarez the highest paid athlete in sports at the time. Next, we have Scott Shaffer, partner at Olshan, Frome, Wolosky, LLP. Scott represents U.S. and international boxing promoters, managers, boxers, and boxing-related media businesses. He has represented leading fight promoters, including DiBella Entertainment, Warriors Boxing, K1 Kickboxing, and world champions like Ricky Hatton, Corey Spinks, John Ruiz, and Kermit Cintron. Scott has obtained title fights for his clients against world champions and Hall of Famers, including Vladimir Klitschko and Bernard Hopkins, among others. In addition, he has negotiated and secured worldwide broadcast and license deals between international networks, including HBO, Showtime, and ESPN. Before becoming a lawyer, Scott was a sports writer for the leading boxing industry publication, The Ring Magazine, and served as an officer of the Boxing Writers Association of America. Next, we have David Slutsker, sports law attorney at the law offices of David Slutsker, PA. David is an experienced deal negotiator, career advisor, and litigator with over 35 years of experience handling the complex career and legal issues that affect highly successful professional athletes. David has represented the world champion or #1 contender in virtually every weight class in the sport of boxing. He currently represents Demetrius Andrade, Clarissa Shields, and Andre Durrell, as well as 2 of the top contenders in the junior welterweight division, Jermaine Ortiz and Michelle Rivera. David has also represented champions including Razor Ruddock, Ray Mercer, Nigel Benn, Jesse James Leija, Tracy Patterson, and Floyd Patterson. Last but certainly not least, and our moderator for today, Kurt Emhoff. He is the host of the Boxing Esquire podcast and staff attorney at Kasowitz, Benson, and Torres. Kurt is a sports entertainment attorney and boxing manager based in New York City, who has represented clients in the sport of boxing for over 25 years. His clients have included over 10 world champions and many top contenders. To name just a few, Winky Wright, Corey Spinks, Paulie Malignaggi, Luis Collazo, Jesus Chavez, Derek Gaynor, Peter the Kid Chocolate Quillen, Edgar Berlanga, and Dimitri Salita. He's also represented some of boxing's top managers and promoters in litigation and sports law engagements. Without further ado, let me turn it to Kurt. Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you, Raul, and gentlemen, great to have you on the panel. A lot of great boxing lawyers, a lot of brain power here. First subject I wanted to get into was broadcast. Every major sport is kind of fueled by broadcast money. I mean, there are other sources of revenue, but it's mostly broadcast. Just to give a quick and dirty background, broadcast in boxing, in my lifetime in the 70s, certainly pre-cable TV, you had the major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, kind of covering the sport on their weekend anthology series, like Wide World of Sports, etc. You also had major heavyweight title fights on prime time on, I guess we'll call ABC and CBS, we'll call that linear TV for reference purposes. Got Ali, Ali basically in 78, the rematch with Spinks was the second most watched television program of all time. Like beat the World Series, Super Bowl, every TV special you can think of. Ali was number 2. So, boxing on linear TV was very successful. Come the early 80s, HBO, premium cable started, picking off the more expensive fights and taking boxing off of linear TV. Major League Boxing, kind of the top fights all ended up on HBO pretty much by the late 80s and through the 90s and into the 2000s. Showtime, another premium cable company, got into it. And those were pretty much Major League Boxing was on HBO and Showtime and not on linear TV. Then the PBC formed. Al Heyman decided to do the grand experiment in 2015 with time buys on linear TV and tried to bring Major League Boxing back to TV. Eventually got a deal on Fox. But lost that deal, and that was in 2015. By 2018, the major players in boxing, in terms of television, you had ESPN, which had done an exclusive deal with the promoter Top Rank. Previously, HBO had not done, for the most part, exclusive deals with promoters. They had just bought the best fights. Top Rank landed the deal with ESPN. PBC ended up on Showtime and Fox. And again, they said eventually they lost the deal in 2022. DAZN, a streaming network, entered the fray in 2018 and brought with, they signed up Matchroom and Golden Boy to exclusive deals. Bringing it to present day, that's kind of where we're at. You have ESPN has Top Rank in an exclusive deal. The PBC is no longer on Fox or Showtime, as both HBO and Showtime have exited the boxing business. PBC has struck a deal with Amazon Prime. Peacock and Sky in the UK have Boxer. It's very little impact over here. But that's pretty much where we are in the television landscape today. It's ESPN, Amazon, and DAZN here in the U.S. With a little bit of Netflix in, but we'll get to that down the line. But I guess I'll throw the first question. I guess we can call it the exclusive promoter era, where instead of the networks buying the best fights, they're signing exclusive deals with promoters to do the fights. And I just wanted to go to Alex because he's in the unique position of representing 2 different promoters right now and kind of a little bit of haves and have-nots. You represent DiBella, who for whatever reason was shut out of a TV deal, but you also represent Queensberry, who has a deal with ESPN Plus and over in the UK, I believe TNT. So Alex, kind of talk about the current landscape and how your clients fit in and how you deal with that as the attorney.
Well, first of all, Kurt, I want to thank you for inviting me. Very happy to be part of a panel with a lot of experts in the industry, but also a lot of people I consider to be friends in the industry, yourself included. So appreciate you having me here. I think just a brief bit of background about who actually owns the rights is sort of important to characterize this conversation. So for the US-based sports audience, ownership of rights is generally pretty straightforward, right? Basketball rights are owned by the NBA, baseball rights are owned by MLB. You get a bit more granular when you get into college athletics, and generally speaking, the individual conferences own the rights to their programming. In boxing, it's far more segregated, right, and far less certain. So in boxing, ownership really comes down to the individual fighters themselves. They own the rights to their own fights. They will generally sign away the rights to promote their fights or the rights to broadcast their fights to promoters. And that's how promoters have been able to package talent to sell to TV networks. Where the paradigm that used to exist, let's call it the HBO paradigm, was that promoters or sometimes even individual fighters or other representatives of fighters would go directly to the networks. And it was a meritocracy. People would sell individual programming or individual fights and would try to sell generally, although with some exceptions, on an event-by-event basis, sometimes a series of event basis. The first exclusive deal that I can remember, at least in this modern era that we're talking about, harkens back to, I think, the mid-aughts when HBO did exclusive output deal with Golden Boy, or a quasi-exclusive output deal with Golden Boy. And that was really the first time in the modern era of boxing that a network had tied itself to one promoter. And in doing so, what Golden Boy was able to do, now obviously they had gotten that deal based on the strength of their roster at the time, but what it allowed them to do was bolster that roster because they could sell the promise of fighting on HBO. Similarly, Al Heyman was able to bolster his roster with the PBC with the promise of being able to fight on Showtime over the last, let's call it, 6 or 7 years. So the ownership really important factor because it's a bit of chicken and egg, right? So do promoters get the output deals because they have the best rosters and are able to deliver the best fights? Generally speaking, so yes. But does it also give them an advantage in the marketplace to sign fighters? Sure, of course it does, because fighters who are free agents who have to sell their rights to a promoter generally to be broadcast will go to the people who have exclusive output deals. And where it's less of a meritocracy, the fighters who, or the promoters who have those output deals are in a very advantaged position to getting fighters to sign up with them to participate or to become part of their stable. So I think to answer your question with that sort of out of the way and the preamble about ownership, with that out of the way, I think what's ended up happening, my own guess, this isn't rooted in much more than my experience watching things play out in the marketplace, is that a lot of entities that have formulated over the last few years or that have attempted to garner programming, DAZN being one of them, ESPN Plus being another one, being an offshoot of ESPN, but a fledgling streaming app nonetheless, that have looked for programming, have seen that box is largely free agency based, and have signed up with promoters to get a constant stream of programming. All right. So in the case of DAZN, for example, they almost immediately signed up, and Sunjay can speak much more to this, but they almost immediately signed up with Eddie Hearn in the United States and the UK. He had a large stable at the time. His stable certainly grew based on the exclusive output deal they did, but it provided a very steady flow of programming. There's certainly a conversation that can be had, and I'm sure we will have it, about what that does to the competition and what that does to the fights that get put on, and what the role of the promoter is to ensure that the quality programming once they have an exclusive output deal. But a way for the networks to ensure that they don't have to, on a fight-by-fight or event-by-event basis, have to go out shopping for programming because they got a promoter with a stable of fighters that can deliver programming. So that may have been a bit more background than you were looking for, Kurt, than an actual answer to the question, but that was sort of my spiel on the exclusive output deals.
One thing I'll add just from the media buying side is when we were at DAZN and just like any other media companies I worked at, we always said content is king and distribution is queen. Like you need both to be a valid business in the streaming space. And candidly, some of the problems in the boxing sport that we'll get to later on in this webinar will be the reasons why these media companies targeted boxing as a way to enter into the US market, candidly, because most other deals were locked in with other networks. So and the reality is if you're asking a fan to pay money per month to sign up to your service and your content is available elsewhere, without any real like distribution or calendar of fights, no one's going to do it. So candidly, we've looked at media rights that were non-exclusive and we've experimented with them and none of them actually worked. But exclusive rights were pretty much the only way to sort of grow the user base at a streaming business, especially a fledgling one, whether it's, DAZN or ESPN Plus.
Great points, fellas. Yeah, I mean, I think what to build on Alex's point. I mean, you look at Matchroom, Top Rank, and PBC, and how many fighters they have in the ratings, and those three organizations dwarf any other organization in terms of rated fighters and top fighters. And you wonder, is it chicken and egg? Is it because they're the better organizations, or is it because they have the TV deals that the fighters are flocking to them or want to get paid? I did want to come back to Sunjay about DAZN, because I remember hearing Joe Markowski a few years ago just kind of lay out what the strategy was as DAZN entered the market, and it seemed like the plan was, I mean, boxing fans get kind of abused in terms of what paying for the top fights, because I didn't mention pay-per-view. Like pay-per-view, most of the top fights are behind the paywall. Like the biggest events in the sport are seen by the fewest viewers in terms of boxing vis-a-vis other sports, because they get put on pay-per-view. There's a high cost, and DAZN had kind of had a plan that, okay, if we get a critical mass of subscribers, and we have top fights every month, we can kind of balance it so that we don't have to put any of these fights on pay-per-view. So talk about how DAZN came into the sport with the game plan and just kind of how it evolved over time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's a secret that when we launched in the US, the plan was not to offer pay-per-view, $9.99 a month or an annual $99 for the year, and provide everyone fights almost every week and at least one high quality fight once a month. The problem is that I think we were unprepared for how much leverage boxers had and how exclusive some of these promoter deals were to create the fights that would justify the $9.99 price per month. Because sure, we had the Matchroom stable, but we still needed to work with, other promotions to make those fights that the fans wanted to see. And if we were not going to be on Showtime or on HBO at the time when we first launched, then we couldn't deliver those fights to our consumers. And the original plan was to grow the sport of boxing, because obviously it's clear that there is a hardcore fan base of loyalists that are willing to spend anywhere from $60 to $90 to watch one fight, which I don't think any other sport can justify, really. Not even the NFL, which reigns supreme in the US. I remember speaking on a panel and I asked the question to the audience, and I asked them, Super Bowl, biggest sporting event of the year, a big moment in the calendar year, whether you're a sports fan or not, how much would you pay to watch it? And I think we settled on $10, which is wild. But people are just not really comfortable paying for sports based on the way it's been served to them for so many years in the past. People don't want to pay for something that has been free. And with boxing, there isn't that issue. But it's really almost impossible to grow that casual fan base if we can't deliver the fights that people want to see, because of all the politics and the lack of unions and governing bodies that kind of like bring everyone together. So we had to pivot, which we were able to do. And we realized that there were, alternative pricing mechanics that we could introduce that would still bring in some casual fans, but still service the hardcore fans in a way that they're not too offended by it, because it's still arguably cheaper than, the once a quarter pay-per-view that costs $90, but still provides a lot of shoulder content, ancillary content, and, weekly fights for young and upcoming fighters that, grow their interest.
It's definitely a conundrum, if I could just jump in here for a second. I don't know about everybody on this panel, but Kurt, and I'm guessing David, we talked about the Ali Spinks being, the huge draw. That was in our lifetime. And boxing, has gone from kind of a mainstream sport to kind of a niche sport. And it's a conundrum for networks because, you have this great product, but in order to present the product, you have to put it behind the paywall. And you kind of, if to take Sunjay's example, if you put the Super Bowl behind a paywall, football probably would lose fans over time. But the market, I think, is still there for boxing. Some of these crossover fights, and I don't know if we're going to talk about Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul, but some of these crossover fights do unbelievable numbers and attract unbelievable number of viewers on social media and other networks. So there's always going to be a market. There's always going to be a market for violence and sex, but there's always going to be a market for violence. It's just trying to find that right balance that's so difficult, between how do we grow the sport and yet how do we, maximize our revenues for this particular event.
Interesting. So yeah, and I wanted to get, I mean, you guys have both kind of touched on it, Sunjay and Scott, the current model you have, not just fighters aligned with different promoters, but now you have the added layer of they have exclusive network deals. So you kind of have, the phrase sides of the street has come up, in negotiations and what have you. And obviously, for programming reasons, network pressure and, you want to keep as many great fights in-house, with the promoters who are on the network. So just as a fighter representative, and I'll go to David on this. I mean, David, you represented Demetrius Andrade, who's been on a couple different networks, been with a couple different promoters. Just talk about what barriers there are in the sport with the different sides of the street and promoters having being on different networks.
Well, thank you, Kurt, and thank you for having me here today. When I started out in 1988, like you were talking about, we had all the networks. NBC, CBS, ABC were in. ESPN had their weekly show. USA Today had their weekly show. And then as you moved up, there was HBO, there was Showtime. Right now, the situation in terms of promoters and the term you use on the other side of the street, if you sign with a promoter that's got a number of fighters, including the world champion in the weight class that fighter's in, that's where you want to be. Because if you sign with a promoter and you say, well, they don't have anybody at 140, or they don't have the champion at 160, or they don't have this. The big fights for me are with this one, and this one, and they're all promoted by this promoter, or two of them are promoted by this promoter. So is it good for the fighter to be able to align with a promoter who's got fighters that he wants to fight? Absolutely. It was the biggest barrier for decades in terms of getting big fights made, because one promoter promoted a champion, another promoter promoted another champion. They couldn't agree on how they were going to share revenue. And the biggest complicating factor, which we don't have to worry about anymore, unfortunately, is that one fighter and one promoter would be at Showtime, the other would be at HBO, and it's like, where's this fight going to be? And if it's going to be HBO or it's going to be pay-per-view, where is it going to be on pay-per-view? And the Tyson Lewis fight was unique in that Showtime and HBO, and I think with Mayweather Pacquiao, both networks were involved. So you had those kind of barriers that have been there for a long time. And now, unfortunately, what's happened is we've lost the networks. We've lost HBO and Showtime is a devastating blow. And what happened when that was occurring over the last 5 or 6 years is we basically, for what's left on the broadcast landscape, have monopolies. I mean, if you want to fight on ESPN, you've got to be with Top Rank. I just did a big title fight Super Bowl week for Clinemont. We're Top Rank, have to be with Top Rank. You wanted to be on Showtime. Unfortunately, they drifted after HBO got out of the business. They drifted over to Al Heyman and PBC. If you weren't with PBC, I had a fight with Crystal Shields. She fought 5 fights in a row and gave them some of the highest ratings. And then Al Heyman comes along and all the dates are taken. Demetrius, you mentioned bouncing around from Showtime to HBO, and then went to DAZN and basically got lost in a streaming service because people were able to see him on HBO and Showtime before that ESPN, and then on DAZN not as much. So the landscape has changed. You got to be very strategic in terms of where you go with a promoter, because it's going to determine what network you're fighting on, because he's exclusive if he has a deal, and what other fighters are at that weight class. And one final point, to what Alex was talking about, I'll bring you back even further in time to this exclusive network type of thing before the Golden Boy HBO thing in the mid-aughts. Back in 1990, Mike Tyson's contract with HBO had expired, and he did a deal with Don King and Showtime, and Showtime had just got into boxing, and Don did an exclusive deal with Showtime, a pay-per-view deal where he started King Vision and SCT, which was Showtime Event Television. So if you wanted to fight on pay-per-view with King, you were fighting on King Vision and SCT, which was Showtime. And he basically took over Showtime because he had the programming. He had Tyson, he had Ruddock, he had Chavez, he had a ton of fighters. As you know, his cards were marathons. So he got that first deal back in 1990 to become exclusive with the network. And then after that, kind of the landscape kind of shifted to exclusivity. That's
Right.
my-
Yeah. I mean, it's complicated. It's complicated representing fighters now that you have, it's with the exclusive deals with promoters and networks. It makes another layer. Just very briefly, we're almost like halfway through here. So, Sunjay, I just wanted to circle back to you, and because you have these barriers and so on. I just wanted to know what kind of relationship you had with your counterparts at the other networks, and what kind of discussions would you have in terms of, trying to cross the street and bridge the gap and have these fights between fighters of rival promoters across networks?
On mute.
Sorry. So I think when you're the lawyers of these boxing companies, brands, networks, your job is to sort of get to a yes, and that's your role. Now, I'm not saying all lawyers in our industry operate that way, but I believe that most of them do, because we understand that if we don't get to a yes in some sort of fashion, the sport loses and our company loses. So I feel like, I had good relationships for the most part with all of the other counterparties that I was negotiating contracts with, whether they be the likes of Alex or, Sean Palmer and Matchroom, or, the lawyers for boxers. I think when it comes to sort of figuring out how to work with other sides of the street, it always comes down to money and projections, right? And it also comes down to leverage too. It depends on who's the quote unquote A side fighter versus the B side fighter, who's the one that has the draw, who's the one that's going to have the leverage, and who has the distribution. Also, it importance what international markets a particular network can reach. I will say that when we do more internationally focused boxing fights, like DAZN does have an advantage over some other networks that are a bit more focused in North America. So I think all of these factors kind of matter. And I think a lot of it is also the relationships between the promoters too. I mean, candidly, I think we all know there's some promoters just hate each other, and they're just never going to work together. And it's just an unfortunate reality. But at the end of the line, we're all in this business to make money, and can play chicken for a couple of months and build the excitement and the hype around a fight. And when the numbers and the price is right, and sort of everything kind of works together, people swallow their prides and their ego to, get the big fights done. I believe it's happening a bit more now with other parties in the space, like Saudi Arabia, which I'm sure we're talking about, and influencer boxing. I think those new entrants force the hands of people that were sort of like, hey, we're just going to wait until the money gets right, or until so-and-so blinks. But that's sort of how I feel like it works. And I think, for all of us on this panel to do our job well, it was all about relationship building, and most importantly, getting to a yes.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Alex, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback on something Sunjay said, because I think he made a great point, and I want to focus on a place where I think the industry probably lost its way over the last couple decades. And it's probably part of the reason why the sport has waned in popularity, at least domestically. And I don't mean to take a parochial stance as it pertains to clients of mine, but as it was mentioned at the outset, I represent Lou DiBella, and he was, before striking out as a promoter, he was the VP of programming for HBO for a number of years. At the time when HBO and premium cable boxing was at the height and was doing great service for the sport. And what always struck me, and what I've always taken from Lou's tenure at HBO, is that he actually met quite regularly with his competitors at Showtime. And they were competitors, but they were meeting to arrange calendars, arrange fights, with an eye towards the fact that what was good for boxing was good for both networks. So competing to the point where they were stealing viewers from one another, or they were hampering the occurrence of the biggest fights in the marketplace within reason, was bad for the sport. And if it was bad for the sport, it was bad for the networks. If it was good for the sport, it was good for the networks. And there was a period of time where boxing became isolated, right? We've talked with, that's the side of the road discussion. And 10 years ago, if you look at the way boxing was laid out, the exclusive deals made it such that promoters weren't just providing programming to networks, they were withholding programming for other networks. And they were making it possible to do the biggest fights. And I think that's what's hampered the sport. Sunjay's right. The influx of money from third parties, from Saudi Arabia, from unforeseen entrants into the space, such as Jake Paul's of the world, have done a really good job at bringing people together. Nothing brings people together like money. And so, but truly, it's done a really good job, because I think people don't think they're fighting for their piece of the pie as much anymore. And it's bringing people together. And ideally, the folk on the quote unquote sides of the street will realize that what is good for the sport is good for everyone in the sport.
That's a great point. And I guess before we leave broadcast, I kind of wanted, you have all these exclusive deals, you have sides of the street, but there's also no barrier to entry theoretically. So, I know, Scott, you represented Triller, who, speaking of Jake Paul, they kind of, I wouldn't say they got him into boxing. He had gotten into boxing and done a pay-per-view, or his brother did a pay-per-view in England that did surprisingly well. Talk about Triller trying to kind of be a disruptor in the game and be maybe, I guess, another side of the street, or just trying to bust into this exclusive boxing game.
Sure. I would say that pretty much boxing follows the golden rule, meaning that he who has the gold makes the rules. And it's always a sport that is open. We're going to get into the lack of central governance, but it's always been a sport that's open to outsiders coming in. And really all you need is to have control of one big attraction, and you can get a foothold, a toehold in the sport. And look, Triller, a disruptor, to me, DAZN at when they started was in a way a disruptor too. Right now, we're going to talk about this more, I'm sure, but the center of the sport is right now in Saudi Arabia, and His Excellency Turki Al-Sheikh is in a way a disruptor. And I think the disruptors become part of the establishment if they can tolerate the short-term losses, or have a long-term interest in the sport, and are willing to commit to it. So Triller made a really big splash when it first started, kind of still involved, but not so much at the moment, because it takes someone who's willing to lose a lot of money. I'm sure all of us on this panel have heard the expression, how do you make $1 million in boxing? You start with $10 million. Disruption is always going to be something that's much more present in boxing than in any of the team sports. You don't need to assemble a team. You need to assemble one person and get a fight that gets the public interest. That's kind of the biggest question right now is, in Saudi Arabia, is this going to be part of boxing's establishment for the long term, or is this going to be a short-term thing that's great while it lasts? And I think everybody in the business is hoping that it lasts forever. But that's kind of the question going forward is, do the disruptors become part of the establishment?
Right, that's a great point. Just before we leave broadcast, I wanted to come back to David. Netflix, another huge streaming service, is dipping its toe in, or maybe not. I mean, they for a long time never did live sports. They are going to do a let's call it a boxing event with Mike Tyson and Jake Paul coming up in the summertime. I know from experience from back in the early 90s, representing I was a paralegal at a firm that represented Mike and Don, and you were on the other side of it with Razor Ruddock. So you've been involved with Mike Tyson for a long time. Just your thoughts on Netflix, having this as their first boxing event and live, boxing event with Tyson and Paul.
Right. Well, I did those deals with King for the 2 Tyson fights. I was 29 years old. I'm 62, and Tyson is still fighting. So it blows my mind. I really wish that there was a real card, maybe Benavidez fighting Canelo or Bud Crawford. To see this, when you say grow the sport, is it good for boxing? And we've been talking about that. Is it good for boxing? Well, is it good for the boxers? It's good for the boxers who can make money doing this, the 1%. Is it good for the fans? I don't know if that's going to grow the sport. I don't know if that's great for the sport of boxing. Is it good for promoters and managers, the ones that are involved in it? I guess. The only redeeming part of that card, I think, is I think Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano are going to have their rematch of the fight you were at the Garden that sold out. It was one of the fights of the year. That is going to be very appealing. That may bring some fans in. But to see Mike Tyson, fight Jake Paul, it's such an amazing venue like Cowboy Stadium. On Netflix, it's great for them, and it's great for the people who are going to make money. I don't think it's great for the sport of boxing. I think Serrano Taylor on the undercard, that's great for boxing.
Right. So speaking of, what's great for the sport of boxing, let's get into the second topic I want to get to, which is governance. And, obviously boxing has no overarching, ruling entity like a FIFA or an ATP in tennis or NFL and American football. It's definitely different than any other sport. I mean, even, from the times of the bare knuckle days, people have always talked about how boxing needs governance and needs some sort of body that oversees it, but they've never had buy-in by all of the essential parties involved. The closest thing we have, I guess, is sanctioning bodies who crown champions and have ratings, but there's like 4 of them, and they're not consistent with their ratings, not consistent with their rules. I think it's, even the general sporting public doesn't give them much credibility. So I guess I'm going to come back to Scott here. Take a shot at it. So someone has given, the Saudis have come to you with in your brain power and say, Scott, we've got all this money. Let's organize the sport. How would you ideally structure a governing entity for the sport of boxing?
Well, I think that the biggest thing missing today is that there's really nobody or no entity or person who's really looking out for the best interests of boxing itself. I remember as a kid reading about baseball, and when there were allegations that the World Series was thrown in 1919, the commissioner was able to, for better or worse, ban these players for life, because the commissioner had the power to act in the best interests of the sport. We saw something similar in the NBA last week when a player, not a prominent player, but a player was basically betting against himself and his team, and he was quite quickly received a lifetime ban. Now, maybe he'll appeal, but both of those are examples of people able to act in the best interest of the sport. There's no one who can do that for boxing right now. So you have all kinds of crazy situations where, you know, boxers test positive in one jurisdiction for steroids or performance enhancing substances, and just go to another jurisdiction and fight. We have a situation you and I discussed earlier where a boxer has just been defeated in one country, and apparently the defeat is not going to count on his record, and he's going to, you know, be able to fight very quickly again in the United States. And, you know, maybe for his health, he shouldn't be allowed to fight. So the question is, what can we do? What would be the ideal structure, which we'll probably never get to, but I think about the countries that, to me, run boxing most successfully, and what come to mind is Great Britain and Japan, and both of them, what they have in common is a strong national commission that governs the sport there. And you know, there was some talk about that probably a quarter of a century ago with John McCain in the United States, and we never got there. But I think you asked me what the ideal structure would be. I think it would be, you know, every country has a strong national commission where you can have national domestic titles that actually mean something, like in fighting Great Britain for the British title or Japan for the Japanese title. Those are meaningful fights that people strive for and bring fan interest to the sport, and bring a structure. Okay, you've conquered your country. Now you're ready to go to the international stage. And then, you know, if we could get in a position, again, not likely, but with strong national commissions, then to have, you know, one overseeing body, maybe something along the lines of an international Olympic organization. And I know that sport is not free from its own problems, but there has to be central organization. Otherwise, you know, I mean, how many people can name the middleweight champion of the world these days? There's 4 different ones or 3 different ones, but you need a central organization with real teeth, the ability to enforce rules, and the ability to act in the best interest of the sport.
Can I just say one thing? So we have the ABC, the Association of Boxing Commissions. So we have a couple states, Nevada, New York, and I'll throw in my home state of New Jersey. When we were, you know, New Jersey was really big in boxing, and Larry Hazard was the commissioner. So those commissions basically run boxing and enforce rules in their state. And if a fighter's suspended or knocked out in one state, the way it's supposed to work through the ABC is that all the other states with boxing commissions honor that suspension or that action, so that if someone is suspended because they tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug, or they got knocked out and they can't fight for 90 days, that is supposed to be enforced, you know, throughout the entire United States for every state that has a commission. So we do have some semblance of that, but we don't have a commissioner to oversee everything. And I don't know if I'm a fan of bringing in the feds to have a federal commissioner, but
Yeah,
maybe we need a stronger ABC. I'm not sure.
I would respectfully disagree with you, David. I mean, I mean, what you're saying is true, but look, I'll give you 2 examples that come to mind. Is Conor Benn is a British fighter who's had PED issues, and my understanding is, and maybe someone can correct me here, he's not licensed to fight in his home country, but he was able to come here and get licensed and fight in the United States. And another example is, again, whether you agree with it or not, when Lennox Lewis was fighting Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson attacked Lennox Lewis at the press conference, a judgment was made by the state of Nevada that Mike Tyson was not in shape to fight, not in emotionally fit to fight Lennox Lewis. But that didn't. The fight just wound up going to a jurisdiction with a weaker commission, and they fought in, I believe, Memphis, Tennessee.
Right.
And so there, you know, that's an example of someone is saying this guy should not be fighting, so he went to a different place and got a fight. So I think that the strong central figure is definitely what's missing. One of the
Scott, I'll give one more example, because I think it's an important one, which is there was a fairly high-profile case of a fighter, a championship fighter, testing positive for performance-enhancing drugs. using a legitimate performance enhancing drug testing protocol in the state of Michigan last year.
Oh, that's
and
right.
Because there was, to put it quite lightly, a weak commission there, or a commission that didn't feel empowered to take action, that fighter was not suspended in the state, and therefore was not suspended in any of the 50 states. There was a period of time where that fighter was suspended by the association boxing commissions, so the association did step up, but that fighter explored fighting outside the country where they wouldn't have been banned. And now, owing to the fact that enough time has passed and the state has taken no adjudicatory measure, that fighter is now free to fight anywhere with virtually no consequence other than a brief timeout by the ABC for testing positive for performance enhancing drugs. So I think one of the arguments for a centralized governing body, and I don't know if it's the feds or I don't know if it's a private body like they have in the UK, but is a uniform enforcement of rules, because we don't have that. And while suspensions may be applied across all jurisdictions, if one jurisdiction fails to act or isn't strong enough to act, then athletes are free to compete anywhere. And so a lack of a suspension is just as good as, right, is a lack of a suspension means that a fighter can get off scot-free, even if the ABC forces commissions to honor suspensions across all jurisdictions.
Kurt, can I just say one quick thing with respect to what Alex said? And also, Scott, I agree with you. There are cracks. There's always look. There was a fight with Lewis and Oliver McCall that should have never taken place because the guy was having a nervous breakdown, which he had in the ring during the fight. But Alex, the interesting thing in Michigan is they actually dissolved their commission, and boxing is run by this thing called LARA, which is the licensing and regulatory agency there. So they don't even have like a real commission there anymore. They just have a licensing and regulatory agency. So in a state like that, I could see how it could fall through the cracks. But yeah, all in all, we need greater uniform governance.
Absolutely, absolutely. I guess we're coming up to about 10 minutes to go, so I'll move forward a little bit. We've touched on Saudi Arabia a little bit. I mean, they've made like big moves in the sport, not just in the sport of boxing. I mean, the Public Investment Fund, has almost $1 trillion in it for Saudi Arabia. So they've made moves, obviously in golf. With the LIV, I mean, there was a lot of litigation, a lot of resistance from PGA of them moving in. They still haven't completed the merger between those two. Tennis, they've put an offer on the table to merge the WTA and the ATP. The Saudis have their own league now, and they poached a lot of the top soccer players. You've got the WWE and UFC, Formula One, all doing big events in Saudi Arabia. And now they've just announced a huge card in Los Angeles where, people are raving about this card. Eddie Hearn calling it the best card ever in the U.S., which I completely don't think it is, but it's a very good card. So some of you guys have done some business in Saudi. Alex, you represent Queensberry, who promoted some very big events and are going to be promoting a big event with Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. Big fights getting made. Boxing fans are loving this. There's not really the resistance that you hear in other sports to the Saudis coming in. I mean, speaking of governance and money and who's got the biggest bank, the Saudis are pretty much calling the tune right now. So talk about working for Queensberry and doing those shows in Saudi.
Well, I think the big difference between boxing and other sports is most other sports don't have the issue of getting best fighters to fight the best, or to get best athletes or best teams to compete against one another. And for better or for worse, His Excellency Turki Al-Sheikh, the National Events Center of Saudi Arabia, their private entity partners over there, have put a focus on spending what's necessary to create the best competition in the sport. It's lacked across the board otherwise, And it goes back to what I said before, which is they have invested enough money in the sport to break down a lot of the segregation in the sport, right? I can proudly say that as of in November, when there was a big show on December 23rd of last year, and we announced that fight in November of last year. And prior to that announcement, Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren, I represent Frank, of course, the biggest promoters in the history of British boxing, had never met each other. They're now filming promo commercials together. Their stables are now fighting one another. I mean, so obviously there are some geopolitical concerns about Saudi Arabia, and I wouldn't sit here and disabuse them. But what I would say is they have spent the money necessary to make meaningful impact in the sport, and a far more meaningful impact in boxing than they'd be able to make in any other sport.
Absolutely, absolutely. Scott, you've represented managers, fighters, who've done some business in Saudi Arabia, from the fighter and management perspective. What's your take?
Well, I work with Zhile Zhang, who's one of the top heavyweights in the world, and we've been fortunate enough to fight in Saudi Arabia and are headed back there in about 5 or 6 weeks to fight again. It's been great. It's been great for athletes. I think the fans have embraced it because compared to other sports, because I think if you're a golf fan, I don't know that you perceived your sport as being broken before the Saudis got in there. In boxing, everybody knows the sport is broken, and so this intervention or disruption, or however you want to call it, is welcome because it has found a way, to overcome all the issues with sanctioning bodies and other sides of the street and exclusive contracts, and there's enough money involved that all these problems can go away. And you're seeing fights. Look, we're going to get to see Peter BF versus Bivol, undisputed world light heavyweight championship fight, a fight fans fight, a great fight that won't exactly capture the public's interest because none of these guys are so well known, but we're getting this fight. And, in a previous generation, Roy Jones and Dariusz Michalczewski didn't fight. The two best light heavyweights in the world didn't fight. I mean, imagine in basketball that the Celtics and the Lakers never met. And that's happened plenty of times in boxing. And we're in an era, hopefully a new era, but maybe just a brief one, hopefully a long one, where that's not happening anymore. We're getting the matchup. So that's why I think everyone is so accepting of this and willing to overlook, some of the issues that other sports fans weren't willing to overlook.
Okay, so I want to get Sunjay and David in here as well, but we do have one question. So if you can be brief here, but Sunjay, I know you worked on a couple fights, Groves and Smith, the World Box Super Series final and the Ruiz Joshua rematch. So just and you worked for DAZN USA. So just talk about some of the issues from the network perspective of putting on those fights and time zones and international rights, and if you can be as brief as you can be, appreciate it. You're muted, Sunjay.
God damn it. Sorry, guys. I'll say that when we worked on the Ruiz Joshua fight rematch in Saudi Arabia, that was not the plan. Like, our plan was to win the exclusive rights globally. We had what we felt was a really good offer out to Matchroom to have the fight and the rematch. We weren't sure if we were going to do it in the US or Mexico, but I mean, that was supposed to be one of the biggest fights of the year, given, how unexpected the Ruiz upset was at the Garden. And honestly, like, Saudi Arabia came with an amount of money that no network in the US could compete with. And personally, like, I thought that was a huge miss for boxing because that was scheduled to be played on Saturday afternoon against college football bowl games, which I think affected the amount of people that watched that fight. So, I mean, to me, that was just really unfortunate. I agree with Alex. There are a lot of benefits to Saudi Arabia coming in, making these fights and these matchups that a lot of people want to see. And I think them actually helping to place a card in the US and the LA with Eddie Hearn is like a great step in the right direction. But I do think it's hard to ask a sport that's trying to grow and capture a more casual fan to watch boxing, you know, on a Friday afternoon when they're at work or on a Saturday afternoon when they're expecting to watch college football. I obviously watched that fight. And I thought, you know, it wasn't the most exciting, but I thought it was a good matchup and it was very interesting. But I think a lot more people would have watched it, especially given how much everyone, you know, rewatched the upset fight if it was on at a normal time, you know, potentially in the US. So, and on the World Boxing Super Series, I mean, it's unfortunate that, you know, that is no longer happening given COVID. But that was just one of our best performing pieces of content on the DAZN platform, because there was a clear winner. It was clear who the champion was. It was a tournament style that people could understand. And it wasn't like there's 9 different champions, one's playing over here, and one's fighting over there. And I wish we had more of those, you know, opportunities. And hopefully maybe with Saudi Arabia's involvement, we'll get there. The one thing I will say, which is the benefit of Saudi Arabia's involvement in the sport. One, it's obviously growing internationally, which is amazing. And you can't sleep on that. And the second is I think it's going to force US broadcasters and US promoters, hopefully to sort of work more collaboratively, or else they'll lose these massive fights to awkward time zones where they're not taking advantage of their pay-per-view buys, you know, domestically.
Great points. David, final word. Saudi's putting a lot of money in the sport. Is it, you know, Sunjay says it's growing it globally. You know, does it grow it here in the US? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think anytime there's an infusion of a lot of money, it's good for boxing. In this case, is it good for the top 2 or 3% of boxers who are going to get these kind of fights? Yes, good for them. Is it going to grow the sport in the United States? Sanjay just said, you know, boxing fans are used to seeing big fights at 11:30 Eastern time and 8:30 Pacific time. And you know what? To grow the sport, these big super fights belong in Las Vegas, belong at Madison Square Garden, belong in Atlantic City at Boardwalk Hall, and some of the other great venues in this country. So it makes it a lot harder for the casual fan, especially for the casual fan who doesn't have the kind of money to fly to Saudi Arabia, stay there, see a fight, and come back. So good and bad. Good as far as the money goes for those that are going to get it. Not that great, I think, for the fans. And for me, I'm old school. I just want to see every one of these big fights in the United States at the iconic venues where they belong.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I think that's we got about a minute left. If that, there was a question from someone in the audience about Ryan Garcia, his willingness to fight pretty much everybody. You know, he's not afraid to take on, you know, it's a little different than what he says was the Floyd Mayweather model, and more the MMA model. So, you know, what is your take on guys who are willing to fight anybody as opposed to kind of protecting their records? Anybody? Scott, go ahead.
Kurt, I'll just say this. I think that any boxer who's willing to elevate the competition level of the sport and is willing to stay active while doing so is materially benefiting the sport. And they're not just materially benefiting the promoters they're working for and the networks they're fighting on, they're materially benefiting everyone in the sport.
I'll also add Ryan is a unique person because he's so relevant as a social media star and a very good looking person that knows how to, you know, reach that non-traditional boxing fan, that I think he understands that having a perfect record isn't the end all be all for his success, which allows him to take bigger risks than maybe someone who isn't as charismatic, that really is relying on that 20-0 record to get the big money for a matchup. Like, I think Ryan knows that he can afford a loss or two, go after these big fights and, you know, get a lot of great brand deals, get a lot of promotion, and sort of establish himself just as a personality, because he's just a great storyteller, similar to Jake Paul. Like, I mean, that's what Jake Paul is. He's a fantastic storyteller. And I think that's an important part to marketing big fights.
Well, I think with that, our time is up. Maybe we even ran a little over. Really appreciate, Alex, Sunjay, David, Scott, everybody for participating. I guess I'll kick it back to Raul for any closing marks.
Yeah, I want to echo that. Thank you all for joining us today and sharing your expertise with the Sports Lawyers Association. I want to thank the attendees for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you all.